Hey, let me recommend this book that I just finished reading, Christianity and Wokeness by Owen Strachan. As you can tell by the title, if you're familiar at all with this, it's a book about critical race theory, intersectionality, cultural Marxism, systemic racism, social justice, all those sorts of things. Very helpful book that I wanted to just do a quick book review for you and just recommend it. If you pick up the book, one of the first things that I noticed in the book was all the endorsements in the first, in the opening of the book. Usually, on the back cover, there's a few endorsements by some high-profile people, but in this one, there was just page after page after page of endorsements that, I know that there's partly that's marketing type of stuff that, they try to get somebody's endorsement. And then, if you follow this person, like some of the guys in here, John MacArthur, Steve Lawson, Wayne Grudem, James Dobson, big name guys that they figure if you're following those guys and they're endorsing it, maybe you'll buy the book. And so I understand it's sort of a marketing thing. However, I thought it was interesting because how many endorsements were in this book kind of shows that it pushes back. It's one of the issues that I've been talking about in recent months about this issue, and see if this makes sense to you. A few years ago when almost nobody in evangelicalism was talking about these issues, and then all of a sudden many of the leaders in Big Eva, we call it Big Eva, in the evangelical, industrial complex, started going woke and started saying things that were very unhelpful. And it was sort of troubling that nobody seemed to be pushing back on these things. I'm talking about people that that otherwise we would have trusted and looked up to, or on our team, you know what I'm saying? And then all of a sudden now they're saying some things that were really problematic. And some of the people that I, circles of people that, friends of mine and stuff, we were talking about it, but nobody, well known was talking about it. And so now they are. Now they are. And when it started out, we started saying, there's only a few people. Maybe this guy's talking about it, and that guy's talking about it, but nobody else is talking about it. Well, now, like I said, page after page after page of endorsements on a very strong statement in this book by Owen Strachan against this prevalent view of wokeness that is popular in the culture and unfortunately creeping into, and in many places, deep-seated in churches and in our evangelical circles. So that's why I'm very excited to see a book like this. For those of you that have seen some other book reviews on my YouTube channel, 4 or 5 of you, they're out there. You may have seen my book review that I did a while back on By What Standard. It was a collection of essays that was put together by Tom Askell and Jared Longshore and those guys. And it was a great book, and I highly recommend it as well. If you didn't see my video on that, check it out on my YouTube channel. And in that review, what I said was that we need more books on this subject. More than just blog posts and Facebook posts and Twitter, exchanges. We need some solid good books from adults that are stepping back a little bit from the flame wars and things like that, and just looking at this issue biblically. And I'm excited that that's starting to happen. That's starting to happen. I reviewed also Vodi Bachum's book on fault lines, or called Fault Lines. If you hadn't seen that review, I also did a video on that one. And now Christianity and Wokeness by Owen Strachan. Owen Strachan's a professor, or was a professor at Midwestern, so one of our 6 Southern Baptist seminaries, and now he's going to another seminary. I can't remember the name of it, but it's a new seminary. I think he's going to be like the provost or dean or something like that. Probably a very good school with him in the leadership. But whatever the case, Owen Strachan is just a solid guy. Used to be associated with the Counsel on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood that Denny Burke is now doing, and so just a great book that I wanted to recommend. Let me say a few things. I don't want to go through the whole book; you can read it yourself. But a few things that I thought were very helpful in the book. One is it's very easy to read. This is not a even though it's detailed, don't get me wrong, it's not. It is detailed. It gets into some very complex issues, but it's not written on an academic, esoteric level that just a regular person couldn't pick up and get a lot from. It's very accessible, very readable. Just your average church member type of person would be very helped tremendously by this book, I believe. In fact, this book actually, it was a recommendation from one of my church members. Actually, this is their book that I borrowed to read, and they were reading it, and they told me they were reading it, and I'm saying, hey, I wanted to read that book too, and so they let me borrow it. But just a great book in on that level that's very readable, and without getting into. I'll discuss that later, kind of the flow of the book. But it's very well organized. And what I mean by that is he writes in a sort of unencumbered style, non-pretentious style, where he literally, in many of the chapters, he'll say things like, look, there's 8 things that are important here. First, second, third, and just goes through and writes several paragraphs on each one. And so he's very easy to follow. Even though he is a good wordsmith, and he says he has some good turns of phrases, and so he's a very good writer, and so it's very easy to follow and ingest his arguments and see what he's saying. So it's very good and helpful. So let me kind of go through sort of just a big picture overview of the book, and then cover some of the strengths in just a second, more detailed. But it starts out, the first chapter is about just wokeness. What is wokeness? What does he mean by wokeness in the culture? Critical race theory, intersectionality, those kinds of things, and just puts it on the bottom shelf. And I think, I think he puts his finger on really the essence and the core of where these things are coming from and what it is, because there's a lot of people. And I don't want to sound flippant, but it seems like there's some people on social media that are like, I'm against critical race theory, and you ask them what it is, and they don't even know. So, and so he kind of pushes through all that and helps just give a general introduction to critical race theory, intersectionality, social justice, what he calls wokeness, and those sorts of things. Very helpful. And so that's the first chapter. And when I say a general introduction, it's not just a generic one. He points that out. He's coming from a biblical perspective, a biblical worldview, unapologetically a Christian treatment on this issue. And so chapter number 2, he deals with how those secular ideologies are coming into churches and into our evangelical world here. And so I thought that was very helpful as well. He is very gracious, though. He says, I understand why some people gravitate toward it. And what I thought was refreshing, he said exactly what I've been saying. I think that there's some evangelical leaders who want the world to think we're not really as bad as you people think we are. When we stand up for things like against things like abortion or homosexuality, there's people in the world that want to fight against that. And I think some leaders are looking for something that the world gets. I don't want to say gets right, but what they think is sort of right. So, for example, a different issue than this book, but even though it is connected somewhat, and I think he mentions that a little bit, the secular world, the media, in the last few years being against sexual abuse. Well, we as Christians are against sexual abuse. And so I think that there's some evangelical leaders that are saying, hey, the world realizes that sexual abuse is wrong. We believe sexual abuse is wrong. We can join in, and maybe we can do some what's called virtue signaling, and say, hey, look, we're good guys. And I think that's kind of what has happened in the racism thing. The world now is saying racism is bad. And then some Christian leaders are saying, hey, yeah, we know racism is bad too. And we want to jump on board with them. The problem is the so-called anti-racism of the world today is really neo-racism. It's racism in and of itself. And it comes from a very anti-biblical, anti-creation order worldview. And so it's wrong-headed. In chapter 2, Dr. Strand, sort of diagnoses some of the problem, but he's really just describing the problem and how these ideas have crept into the church. And then in chapter, I'd have to look at it, I think it's chapter 3 and 4, the next couple of chapters or so, he deals with the idea of race in Scripture. Actually, he says race is a social construct. It doesn't really exist. There's one race, the human race, and so that's what the Bible teaches. But the Bible does deal with ethnicity, and so he kind of deals with that in Old Testament, New Testament, ethnicity, and all the rest. And I thought it was very helpful. He does not fall into the trap, even though he kind of dances on it a little bit. But he shows the distinction between what the Bible is dealing with, some animosity between Jews and Gentiles in the early church, and some people want to completely take that into the race discussion, and it's really not a one-to-one correspondence, because Israel, Old Covenant Israel, was the covenant people of God, and the Gentiles were not. And so what's going on there is something that is very covenantal rather than just ethnic hostilities that have existed and exist all the time in all sorts of different contexts throughout history. And so he deals with some of that, and I thought that discussion was very helpful. One of the things that I thought about when he's dealing with ethnicity in the Bible, I would love for him to hear him and Jarvis Williams, Dr. Williams at Southern Seminary, sort of sit down in the same room and talk about these kinds of things. Jarvis Williams is one of those in the Southern Baptist Convention. I'm Southern Baptist. That is pretty woke in his ideology. Although Dr. Williams does critique critical race theory, he says that there's some problems with critical race theory. He doesn't fully endorse critical race theory, but he does see some advantages and does see some some things in critical race theory that we as Christians can utilize. And Owen Strand correctly points out the fact that is a erroneous strategy. We cannot use critical race theory even as an analytical tool, as they say. But the reason why I mentioned Jarvis Williams especially is because Jarvis Williams is coming out with a book sometime this fall on ethnicity in the Bible. And so I think that would be a very interesting discussion, instead of just talking past each other, to see where we can sort of advance the ball down the field and see some things more correctly. I think that Jarvis Williams' book on ethnicity in the Bible is going to be very interesting. And I think there's going to be some problems in it. I don't want to go in it with preconceived notions, but knowing other things that he said, it seems like there's going to be probably some problematic things. And so it's going to be interesting to see and compare what Jarvis Williams is saying about ethnicity in the Bible and what Owen Strand says ethnicity in the Bible, and see how those two things line up or don't line up, whatever the case may be. So I was thinking about that when in those couple of chapters. And so then what Strand does is the next couple of chapters then deals with why these things are problematic. He sort of hints at it, and some of the things are sort of obvious in the first few chapters. But then he spends at least one or two chapters on that directly. Here are the problems from a Christian worldview, from a biblical perspective, from the creation order, why wokeness is problematic. And I think that's one of the chapters where he says there's like 12 things and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and just goes down the list and deals with those and just picks it apart and very helpful in that. And then there's a final chapter on, it might even be an appendix, listed as appendix, I can't remember, but the last chapter is on some American history. And so he deals with some of those issues that are coming out of things like the 1619 Project, if you're familiar with that, which is really driving, well, 1619 Project is not driving it, but the ideology behind the 1619 Project is driving a lot of these things that we're seeing in culture today that are saying that that the American experience was built upon racism, has racism at its core. It's inextricably linked with racism, that you can't get away from it, and all the rest. And he pushes back on that and tries to unpack that and shows how that's just not the case. That's just not true. It's a twisting of history there. Even though he doesn't go quite as far as I would go, to be perfectly honest with you, and I don't want to chase that rabbit. I'll talk for another half hour if I do, but he does a good job. He does a good job. I'll just leave it at that. I could nitpick a few little things, but I'm not going to do it in this video. One other thing that I was going to mention, that I think he's very, I think this is a strength of the book, that he's not like some of the arguments that you see online that just blast everybody that says anything that's remotely connected and might be sounding somewhat woke. He actually is honest and says, look, like systemic racism, for example, systemic racism in some ways has existed in America in the past. I mean, you have to be dishonest not to say that, the systemic racism of Jim Crow laws or redlining or, the racial component of antebellum slavery. You can't say that those things were not racist. They were. They were. And he also says, he admits that some of those things have repercussions even today. Now, that's really, to me, that's the nexus of where the conversation needs to be, because that's really where I think some people are talking past each other. And the people that are against wokeness don't want to give an inch because they want to win the debate. And Owen Strachan says, look, the truth can uphold investigation. And the truth is that some of those things do have lasting implications today. Now, it's nothing like what the woke crowd says they are. And it's not, and the solution of just burning the whole system down is not a solution at all. And so he deals with some of those things. And so that's why I like the fact that he was honest with it and deals with it respectfully, with clarity, and with boldness. I mean, he don't hold back. It is no holds barred. He doesn't treat the subject with kid gloves or anything else, but he deals with it honestly. Something that a lot of people online, some YouTubers and bloggers and the rest, don't seem to be willing to do. I think that they're scared to give an inch on it and treat the subject with honesty and integrity. But Dr. Strachan does that, and I think that's a very helpful thing. So I'm not going to belabor this anymore. It's already been long enough, because I don't want you to be sitting around watching YouTube videos all day. Turn YouTube off and read a book. And a great book would be Christianity and Wokeness by Owen Strachan.